Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Spiritual Cake Podcast. We talk about anything and everything that has to do with that spiritual side of our existence. You're familiar with the physical and the mental and the emotional. We have been discussing the spiritual, whatever that is. My name is Clint Houghton. With me is Wendy Dahl. Wendy.
Hi, Clint.
Hello, Wendy. If you're joining us for the first time, you should know that neither Wendy nor I run any kind of a religious organization, nor has our formal education been along those lines. We're both raised relatively conservative Christian. Wendy is Mormon. I was raised Lutheran, but have since explored a lot of different theologies and philosophies. Plus, we are both in the event industry with an international clientele, and that has exposed us to a lot of different rituals, customs, traditions, and we bring all of that into this conversation. And that's exactly what it is. It's a conversation. And if you want to join the conversation, then at the end of this episode, we will tell you how to do that. The fact that I call it a conversation, I think is really important, but we've never really addressed it. It's not like we're telling people what to do. We're just you and I discussing what's out there and how it makes us feel or that sort of thing. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
That's definitely a fair assessment.
Yeah. And so I don't want to change anything. But something did come across my desk that I thought was interesting. Are you familiar with the website Quora, Quora?
Yes.
So I think we've talked about this in a previous episode. Every now and then, I'm on the email list. And so once or twice a day, I'll get a Quora email that I think they think I would be interested in. And I know you can sign up for what are you interested in and that sort of thing. And so spirituality is one of those things. Religion is one of those things. I'm going to show you what I was looking at. This came across my desk. I'll admit I am not educated to this level. The guy who wrote this post, Francis Marsden, he's legit. I mean, in fact, let me go down there and I'll show you what I'm talking about. 41 years a priest with Cambridge chemistry doctorate, studied philosophy and theology, graduated in 85, lives in the UK. And so I would tend to think he knows what he's talking about. So anyway, the Codex Sinaiticus is the world's oldest Bible. This is the question. If you were to compare and contrast it with the Bible we have now, what would the differences and similarities be? First of all, did you even know there was such a thing as a Codex Sinaiticus?
No.
Neither did I. Okay, then he says the Codex Vaticanicus is slightly older from 300 to 350 AD. Then the Sinaiticus from 350 to 375. Both are Greek. Would you say there's that UNCIAL? Uncial? What'd you
Sure.
pronounce? Yeah, let's go with that. Manuscripts written in capitals. I don't know what that means, but they're in different languages, I'm pretty sure. The Vaticanus has over 760 parchment pages with a few missing or slightly damaged pages. This is old school, old school, old school. Both follow the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, completed by and for diaspora Jews 300 to 200 BC. It has the deuterocanonical Old Testament books, which Luther, I said I was raised Lutheran, and it's that guy.
Really? I
Yeah,
always wondered how Lutheran became to be.
yeah, it was Martin Luther. And the way I explain Lutheranism or whatever to people, I think, well, just imagine Catholicism, and we're one big piece of paper nailed on the outside of the cathedral apart from Catholicism. Lutherans are very conservative, by the book, for real, by the book. Anyway, Lutheran was the guy who said, these are some things in Catholicism that I don't agree with. And I guess back then, church and state were very, very intertwined. And so it was a big risk that he protested, and hence that's all of the offshoots of the Protestant movement. And by nailing I forget there's a name for the doctrine, but anyway, he nailed it on the outside of the chapel doors. So this guy says that Luther dumped those books, as do the 5th century codexes Alexandrinus and Ephraemi Rescripti.
There you go. You sound
They,
fancy today.
I know they say words that I don't know. The Bible, as we have it today, is made of the best readings of 20 or 30 early codexes, thousands of papyri fragments, thousands of translated copies in Old Latin, Late Latin. Oh, I guess there's a difference. Old Latin and Late Latin, Vulgate, and Armenian, Syriac, Coptic, Ethiopic. What? Why would there be original texts in Ethiopic? That's interesting. Most of these agree, but here and there one finds slight variants. A Greek New Testament, like Nestle Aland, shows all the variants as footnotes. The Hebrew Old Testament text is much less certain and in some places altogether uncertain. It has only the consonants, not the vowels. Didn't know that,
Hmm.
which can give rise to several variant readings in many places. The earliest full Hebrew texts we have date from the 10th century AD and were the work of the Masoretes, rabbis who added the vowels. Some part of the Old Testament books have been found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then they have these people that will comment on that and saying, well, there's this, but that, and this, but that, and this, but that. But the reason I bring this up is I always am kind of curious. We just accept the Bible as the Bible, and most of us don't really question where did this come from? What's the deal? How legitimate is it? And that sort of thing. We were told that some council in the 15 or 1300s decided this is going to be the Bible, and there's a bunch of other stuff that goes on. So I think the Jewish Bible, which Christians would call the Old Testament, actually has more to it. The Catholics have a Bible that has some more to it, the Apocryphal, I think they call that. So then I thought, well, how many different versions of the Bible are there? And I turned to the third member of our podcast, which is ChatGPT, and I said, how many English Bible versions exist? It looks like the sources are mostly Wikipedia, 100 plus complete English translations, because that's all I was concerned about. I just wanted to know what's in English. I read someplace that there's 2,000 translations of the Bible around the world, which makes sense because, you would want to have it in the native tongue of whoever you're trying to give it to. So then English is the only thing that I was really concerned about. So 100 plus. 450 plus translations of at least part of the Bible, and up to 900 English translations and paraphrases since the 1500s. That paraphrase thing can be a little dangerous. I mean, I don't know about you, but whenever I've paraphrased a story or a quote, it's not 100% accurate. I guess maybe that whole thing that you've talked about, the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, could be like a paraphrase situation in regards to what the scriptures are actually saying. What do you think about that?
I mean, it's possible. What's interesting about what you just said about the number of versions, one of my sons works at Barnes and Noble, and they had him organize the Bible section of the store. And he was like, I had no idea there were so many Bibles
Yeah.
and so many versions of the Bible. And even more interesting, I think it was last year in the Mormon faith, you've always read the King James Version, which I started reading again this year. And it strikes you different every time you read it. What I leaned into it this year was how the whole beginning gives like credit to King James, which to me is very interesting because you're talking about the Bible, which is the word of God, and wouldn't it give credit to the people who wrote it? That's just a Wendy opinion. We've actually been told to read more than the King James version now, which has never been a thing in the past, which is also interesting because I have many versions of the Bible in my home simply because when I go and watch ceremonies and I hear them quote scripture, I was like, well, how come my scriptures don't say that? That's a beautiful thing. And so I would find out what Bible they had and I would go buy the Bible because I was like, I want the quotes, this is good stuff.
So how many
And
versions of the
so,
Bible do you have in your house?
oh gosh, I probably have maybe a dozen, maybe more. I mean,
No
and there's
kidding.
also on my iPad, I have one on my iPad, the Kindle, I have more. But yeah, and it's interesting because I get them as I discover different areas of focus. Like I have one by Stephen Covey that focuses on leadership.
Was Stephen Covey Mormon?
Probably I think he might have been because his business is in Utah. I don't know. I've never
I never thought of that
researched that.
before. He wrote, just for clarification, those who don't know Stephen Covey, wrote
He
Habits
wrote
of
it.
Highly Successful People or
That's
something
it.
like
The
that.
Seven Habits of highly successful people.
Yeah.
Right. So his is based on leadership with the presumption that the best examples of leadership come from the Bible. That was an interesting read. And then the next one I want to get is about women in the Bible. It was interesting.
Oh,
I was in a class the other day and they were asking like who your favorite person of the Bible was. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's like I said whichever one it was. And the woman that was up there knew so much more about the story than I did. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I totally thought I knew it all. And I was like, I need to go back and read more about that story. As far as like getting back to the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, I think that's more of the way that you internalize what you're reading.
that's a
Yeah,
very good
depending on
point.
which version you're reading a similar text or you're reading, holy text that's been translated. And I've often contemplated about translations too, because we talk about the Book of Mormon being translated and how it was translated. People that really pick apart Joseph Smith and the whole translation of the Book of Mormon don't take into consideration like the Bible was also translated. So for me, learning more about translations and how they're translated and what language they started out in and where they ended up and who did what and when they did it has always been interesting to me.
Well, let's dive deeper, shall we?
Good.
Okay, so I was curious about the 10 most used. I forget exactly how I said that, but most popular in chronological order. So you can see the year on the left-hand side, the year that the Bible was published or became accessible. It started with the Wycliffe Bible in 1382. That was the very first complete English Bible in Middle English. The other thing that's interesting to me is the abbreviations. I got confused with that. And so further down, we'll see. I asked ChatGPT to give me the full name. I don't know about you, but I was like, well, I don't even know what that says. I don't know. The abbreviation didn't really do it for me. So
Right.
anyway, and then 200 years later, about 150 years later, the Tyndale Bible, the first printed English translation from Greek and Hebrew. See, now some people would think that's a direct translation. You know what I mean? Like you're not translating it from. I had a Sunday school teacher that always read the King James version, and I said to him, there's newer translations. He said, yeah. He says, but imagine that you've got a bucket of water and you're going to pour it into another bucket, which would be like translating it. But you know that there's still a little bit of water that's going to remain in the original bucket. He says, that's the way I feel about it. By saying it that way, he was saying that the King James version is like the original translation. And we can see right here that that's not true. Later on, I didn't have the education to be able to discuss this with him. But later on, I realized that I don't think modern translations come from the King James version. They come from the sources that created the King James version. So they go back to the original. And I think ChatGPT will give us a little more information on that. First of all, does that make sense, what I just said?
It does, and I'm glad that you're pointing out which text they actually translate. Because I've often wondered that too, where I was like, so is the new King James version, is it just taking the existing King James version and updating it, or did they go back to the original text and
Well,
translate
I think the new King James version, they did exactly what you just explained, which is they
it?
took the old King James and created a new King James. I think it was something like that. In 1560, the Geneva Bible, that's really familiar to me. The Geneva Bible, popular amongst Protestants and pilgrims. Then there's the King James Version in 1611. And you can see it's the most influential English Bible. It still is one of the best sellers to this day. The American Standard Version, I remember that. That was in 1901. The Revised Standard Version, I remember that. My mom was the secretary to the church that I grew up in. She was very well educated and knew all of this kind of stuff. In fact, I think she even started to learn Hebrew or Greek, one of those two things, just to kind of deepen her understanding of what was going on. My mom was pretty amazing. So there's the New American Standard Bible. I remember that in 1971. That's the year that I graduated from high school. The fact that it's described as a highly literal translation, I don't really understand what that means, unless it was like we're talking about from the original text in order to make it as close to the English language understandable, even though I know there's some colloquialisms that have a hard time translating word for word. Then the New International Version in 78, the New King James Version, there you go, in 2001, 2002, the English Standard Version, ESV. So these are the top 10 versions to this day. Here's what I was talking about. I said, give me the sales rankings. It gave me this. And then I said, come on, man, tell me what those mean. Once again, these are in order of sales. The New International Version, the best-selling modern English Bible, then the English Standard Version, the New Living Translation, the Christian Standard Bible, the King James Version is number 5. The New King James Version is number 6. Do you have them both?
I do.
Do you see a drastic difference?
I do.
Oh, no kidding. Okay. Huh.
Yeah, and it's exactly like one is in, I would say, like an old-fashioned language, and the other is new language, like how we speak today.
Right. Which is the purpose, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
You ever read Shakespeare?
Oh yeah, it's really hard to read Shakespeare.
Sometimes it is. Well,
Yes.
imagine if you have to say it in front of an audience, which I've had to do a couple of times. It's interesting how a really good director will sit you down, or the actors and the whole cast will sit them down and explain to them the structure of the language, the meaning of the language. There's a rhythm to it that will help you understand what was actually trying to be said. There's a whole background of education that really informs what is presented, when the play goes up. So I would imagine there's a similarity to this in regard to the original King James and the New King James and all that kind of stuff. Just imagine the people that had to go and do that work. The
Right.
International Reader's Version, as opposed to what? The audio version? I don't know. The New Revised Standard Version and the Message. Oh, paraphrase rather than direct translation. Oh, that's what we were
Hmm.
talking about.
Yeah.
That's interesting. You ever heard of that? The Message?
No.
I remember there was a Bible that came out and they put a different name on it. Maybe this is it. Anyway, it was this is the Bible, but it's really
I wonder if
new.
it's something like the 2 hour Bible. You know how
Have you heard of
they
that?
No, I'm just wondering if that's what they did, because if you paraphrase something, that means it's definitely shorter. And if you have two
That's true.
hours and you can read a paraphrased version of the Bible, you can technically say you read the Bible,
Yeah, that's up for debate.
depending on who it is that you're talking to. Hmm.
Are you still going through that program where you're reading the Bible?
I am.
Where are you now?
I am in the part where I think it's Jacob, Leah, and I forget the other sister's name, but there's like this competition over who can have the most babies for Jacob. And they like
Wow.
offer their maidservants. So it's like essentially like two sisters and
Oh,
Jacob. It's kind of an interesting thing where I'm like, oh my gosh, here's some drama happening in the Bible.
you know what?
So,
I think that just came across my Quora feed where somebody
mhm.
said something about Jacob had four wives, and the person said, no, 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 I had two wives and the handmaidens. And
The
I thought,
handmaiden.
man, life was a little crazy in the Old Testament. It got a little
Right?
wild. It
I
did.
know. It's really funny. So after I go to church on Sundays, I usually have a conversation with ChatGPT about some harebrained idea that I have. I have an iPhone, and so it like serves up the apps that it thinks that you're going to use when you use them. So
Right.
now like ChatGPT is the first app that shows Sunday afternoons. I was going to deep dive all about that whole scenario. Like, tell me all the stories. What else has been, discussed? I want to hear more about the sisters. It's more about like a historical perspective, but I want to know the history of the sisters. Were they close before they both married him? And it was like a trick that he married the older, I don't remember the older sister's name, but it was a trick that he had to marry her first in order to marry the one he wanted to marry. And it was just an
Oh,
interesting thing.
that's Shakespearean. That's Taming of the Shrew.
Right.
Yeah, there's two sisters, and a guy falls in love with the younger sister, but the dad won't let anybody court the
Get
younger sister
married until
until
the
the
older
older
one.
one. Yeah, which
Hmm.
is and hilarity ensues.
Yeah,
So
so I wanted to know more about the women because I'm so curious. Like, how did they feel? I would be ticked if I had to marry the same person as a sibling married. I'd be like, no,
different
I don't think
world,
I want to do that.
different
I know it's a
world.
different world, but like,
And then there's a whole thing that came out today. It was a report in one of the major publications, the Times or somebody, about the birth rate. People are getting kind of freaked out because not as many babies are being born. Research has shown it's one of those things where is it causation or coincidental? And if you go a little bit deeper into the data, it's a fascinating thing when the babies are being born and all that kind of stuff. So that whole thing about what was going on in the Old Testament, that's a different ball game.
I know, but it doesn't quench my curiosity.
Oh, no. And I hope it never does. Yeah, I
Yeah.
hope so. Okay. So now this is going to tell us which churches, what version they prefer for their congregation and for their system. So the evangelical Protestant churches, they like New International, the English Standard, the New Living, the Christian Standard, and the New King James Version, which makes sense. It makes sense to me because they're Protestant. You know what I mean? It seems like the Catholic would be more entrenched in tradition and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Baptist churches, non-denominational churches, evangelical mega churches, and then the Calvary Chapel style churches. I didn't know that that was like a style. That's interesting. You know what the Calvary Chapel is? You know about all that?
In Anaheim.
Well,
That's
okay. So the origination, this is my understanding, and we'll do a deep dive in a later episode, that there was a guy in Orange County, California, who was baptizing people in the ocean. His name is
mm,
Chuck Smith, and he started this church called the Calvary Church, and it just grew and grew and grew. He got written up in Time magazine back in the day when Time magazine was a legitimate source of news, and as opposed to today when we go to ChatGPT. It grew amazingly. It was a phenomenal thing, and he one day we'll talk about Chuck Smith. He was a pretty interesting guy. So why do those specific denominations use those types of Bibles? Because they like the modern language. It's easier to understand. And there's a good balance of readability and accuracy. See, that's really important because if no one's going to read it or they don't understand what they're reading, then you don't really have much of a system. So the conservative Reformed traditional Protestant will go to the original King James Version, the English Standard Version, or the New American Standard Bible. Reformed churches, Presbyterian, conservative branches. There you go. Baptist, King James only churches. They like a more literal translation. See, I have a little difficulty with that language of literal translation because there's vernacular from, it's regional. You can say if you grow up in a very proper King's English, then you're going to have a familiarity or an understanding that's completely different than you grow up in some kind of low education rural area type of deal. So it just depends. The mainline Protestant churches, the New Revised Standard, Revised, I can see a theme going here, but they really like the ones that are newer. Methodist, Lutheran, mini synods. That's how they divide up the Lutheran into what they call synods, SYNODS. Episcopal, Anglican, Presbyterian, scholarly translations. That's interesting. I guess maybe they have a little more faith in the process of the translation and how deep it goes. They're used in seminaries. Oh, how about that? Roman Catholic churches, the New American Bible, that's a surprise. The Revised Standard Version Catholic edition. I think we talked in a previous episode about how the Catholic version has like 4 extra books, I think. Do you remember that?
Nope.
Well, we did.
But that's
And
interesting.
the New Jerusalem Bible, they use them because they're approved by the Catholic Church. Oh, here we go. It includes the deuterocanonical books, the Apocrypha. That's what I'm talking about, the extra books that are in the Catholic Bible. Orthodox churches, New King James, Revised Standards. Oh, they're closer to the ancient Greek texts. I didn't know that. Academic and interfaith settings, the New Revised, and universities, seminaries, and interfaith study groups, which makes sense because they would want it in the most relatable language, I'd guess. Highly respected scholarship. The New Revised Standard Version and the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition. Okay, so then here we go. These are the Bibles that evangelical churches like those and conservative and so on. An interesting detail, the King James Version is over 400 years old, but still among the top 5 in sales. And then which is the most accurate? Well, there's 2 types of accuracy. Word for word accuracy, formal equivalence is closest to the original Hebrew and Greek. Wording, the thought for thought accuracy, dynamic equivalence, closest to the original meaning in modern English. Maybe that's a little bit more of the letter of the law, spirit of the law. Maybe it's that kind of a thing. What do you get from that?
That could be very true. I think about word for word accuracy and I wonder because I mean even today you see all the new videos with the words that the kids are using where I was like, "Oh my gosh, their generation has slang words too." And that's only in our lifetime. And so, in our lifetime, our parents have had their language, we've had ours, our kids have theirs,
Oh yeah,
and the younger one. So I just think about, over the 4 decades, there's been a lot of change to language, and I can only imagine that if you were to take something literally, it might have meant something completely different that we don't understand. I watch these words that these new kid that the young kids are using, and I was like, they can have that. I'm just gonna live in my own little bubble here where my language is normal. But yeah, I feel like that might be something that where they're trying to think of like the thought where it's like, well, what did they mean when they said this? Even in one region of the United States, if you say something like,
sick. The word
yeah,
sick.
yeah, it could be positive or negative, and you
Right.
don't know the context. And
Right.
so, and I'm wondering if that's kind of what they were thinking when they did the thought for thought accuracy, because it could say one thing literally, but not even mean what it's
I
saying.
remember there was a TV show on the Disney Channel. I watched everything my kids watched. There was a Disney movie that came out, and you could tell that the actresses decided to make it as current as possible. But when I watched it like 2 years later, it was so outdated, in terms of the phrases they used. It was an interesting thing. And I thought it reminds me of men's clothing. If you always go to a classic look, let's just say a suit, you'll never have to worry. It's never going to go out of style. There may be nuances to the suit that come and go, but a basic suit is always going to be. And so if there's basic language, I think that will serve in the long run. Does that make sense?
Yes.
The most textually precise, we're almost out of time, the New American Standard Bible, often regarded as the most literal English translation. Okay, well, we have run out of time. And so, but this is fascinating. What do you think of all this?
I think it's great. I mean, I hate to say it, but there's a Bible for everyone, depending on what you're looking to get from a Bible. If you're going for the ancient language, or if you're going for more commonly used language, or a 2-hour Bible read. I think any exposure to biblical text is good exposure.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. Like we said, the Old Testament gets a little wacky.
Well, sure, but it is interesting. I mean, it has me thinking about those 2 sisters
Oh,
beyond
no
me
doubt.
reading the Bible. I want to know all about them.
Yep, no doubt. If you put it in the proper context, that maybe what you're reading is a fable or a story with a moral or a story that's been passed down through generations. And you know how it is when you play telephone at a party. But if you kind of give it that grace, that space, if you will, the underlying messages, whether they be overt or in the subtext, I think can be really positive. I agree with that. And if you
Yeah.
get blocked by the language that you don't understand and that makes you, shun, then making it more accessible, I agree with that
Yes.
100%. All
Uh,
right, Wendy, tell everybody how they get in touch with us.
You can find us at spiritualcake.com, where you could go back and listen to or read any of our previous episodes. You can click one of the two social media icons and join us on Facebook or Instagram, or you can send us a message requesting a topic or even to join the conversation.
Absolutely. And when you do join the conversation, please know we welcome you with open arms. That's it for this episode of the Spiritual Cake Podcast. This is Clint, and on behalf of Wendy, we will see you next time.